So welcome everybody. My name is Jenny Uehling and I'm one of the members of the AOS Student Affairs Committee webinar subcommittee, I guess. And we're very lucky today to have Dr. Stepfanie Aguillon here. She's a Stanford Science Fellow and she's going to be leading us in a workshop on making effective figures. Before we get started with all of that, I just wanted to remind everybody that the newly rebranded webinar subcommittee is putting on several different events over the course of the next couple of months. We have a lot of exciting webinars in the pipeline, so please just keep a lookout in your emails for announcements about future events. Teresa, am I missing anything else I need to say? Nope. Okay. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Stepfanie. Thank you so much for being here today.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me, Jenny. I'm going to put this pre-workshop survey in the chat again. And maybe Jenny or Teresa, you can send it out again in like a few minutes in case people have missed it. I'm going to share my screen and organize my windows a little bit so that I can see and also see the chat. Okay, and try to not cover up too many things. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so it's really great to be here talking with you all. I really like talking about figures, and that's the reason Jenny invited me to give this workshop. I've given this workshop a few times, most of them during grad school, went to Cornell, and so that's where Jenny knows me from. And I'm excited to sort of give you a sort of rebranded, updated workshop here today. And I thought I would start by saying one of the updates that I've done is making a lot of this available on GitHub. So you can find a companion guide with code on my GitHub page. The URL is here. And the idea with this is that making these figures requires code. And that's not what this workshop is about primarily, but obviously to get to the point of having a figure, you sort of need that code. Examples throughout this GitHub repo that's on there use the Palmer Penguins R package. And what I'm going to do in the presentation is basically I will have this little icon here that says GitHub in the corner of slides, where there is an associated part of this companion document. This slide is just describing this penguins data set. This is a really nice example data set that is bird related, has 3 penguin species, various morphological measures. And the idea with this is similar to like, say, the iris package. The iris package is one that's used really commonly with data science. And it was originally published in the Annals of Eugenics, so I don't really like to use it. So the penguins data set is a great alternative and bird related, so I really like it. That's all I will say about GitHub and like code and stuff, but anytime you see one of these icons, there's associated code to think about how to code some of the things we're talking about. Okay, so today what we're mainly going to be talking about is some design principles. These are clarity, color, emphasis, and consistency. I like to think of these as 3 C's and an E. They're obviously not in that order because I want consistency to be last, but this hopefully is a good way to remember this. And we're going to go over these sort of one category at a time. And what I wanted to start with is sort of potentially a controversial opinion. And as I go through, please feel free to chat. I have the chat open and I'll ask some questions and you can respond in the chat and I'll see those. And the controversial opinion I want to start this workshop with is that figures are the most important part of any paper or presentation. I don't know if you will agree with that statement at this time. Maybe by the end, I will have convinced some of you to agree with the statement. But for me, figures really are the most important thing. Obviously, your data needs to be solid, your analysis needs to be solid, the writing, all of that is important. But figures really are what make the paper or make the presentation. So it's really important that you sort of know how to make nice figures. So I'm going to show you here is a figure from one of my recent papers. This is a paper that just was accepted I guess maybe a month ago now. This is figure 1 from this paper. It has lots of color, it has a map, it has like all of these nice components. And I'm on Twitter, and so I tweet about a lot of my work. And, you know, it is something that really, the figures really make that possible. So for instance, if I show you results from this paper, and I highlight the relevant results and the figure that shows those results, I imagine where your eye is drawn is not to the text, but instead to the figure. And hopefully that sort of demonstrates how useful these figures are. So when I tweet about these papers, I get lots of comments that are like, wow, this is great. This is such a beautiful figure. I'm like really excited to read this paper. And you know, if I wasn't tweeting about the figures themselves or having nice figures to tweet with, it wouldn't be possible to have this sort of response. And so tweets where I include figures get really good traction. And you know, if you don't have good figures or you don't think figures are important, I would suggest you sort of think about that a little bit and you know, imagine why you are thinking that, and maybe try to open yourself up to like thinking about figures in a way that is very critical and like seeing them as an important part of the work that you're doing as a scientist. So in this workshop, we're going to approach this in a way that thinking about how you want to make your figures. So your goal really is to convey information as clearly, accurately, and efficiently as you can with your figures. You want your readers to look at your paper or look at your presentation and just understand what you're trying to see them, to have them see. So you don't want them to look at a figure and be like, I don't get it. Like, why is that color? Or, you know, why is, you know, it doesn't make sense to me. You want your readers to really see it and understand it very easily. And you also don't want to confuse them in a way where you're like misleading them. So you don't want to mislead your reader into thinking your figure says something that you don't want it to say. So we're going to sort of talk about how to approach these things from a design standpoint. So again, I'm going to talk about these 4 categories today. We're going to start first with clarity. So when I say clarity, you probably sort of get the gist, but the idea is you want your figures to be clear and easy to understand. So you want them to be very, very clear. So we're going to start with a question. So if we're thinking about symbol style, that's where we'll start. We'll talk about a few different things within symbol styles. I have a question, which is, which symbol is the best to use? So I'm showing you here a bunch of different symbols. You have open circles, closed circles, squares, both open and closed, triangles, both open and closed, crosses, both open and closed. I want you to look at these. I want you to take a second, go with your gut, and tell me which symbol you think is the best to use. Go ahead and type your answer into the chat. You don't have to think too hard, just whatever moves you. Okay, so a lot of 1s, some 5s, some 7s, 3s, saw some like combos, 3 and 7, I think 1 and 7 maybe I saw, 1 and 3, 3 question mark. Okay, so this seems like a sort of wild question, like, you know, why would one symbol be better than another? Like, it's just a symbol. And what I would like to argue is there is a correct answer to this, or at least, you know, gradations of correct, like 1 is probably better than most of the others. And so what I would argue is that number 1 is better than many of these other options. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that when these circles intersect, they don't form a separate image or a separate symbol. So like with the squares, for example, the intersection of the squares form other squares. Same with the triangles, the crosses, the intersections are just kind of confusing. You have like other shapes. So there's that. But then why open versus closed? So I see a number of people chose some of the closed symbols too. With the open circles, the overlap region, the region where you have lots of points overlapping, leads to higher density. And you see that with sort of all of the open symbols, but you can kind of see, so regions where there are many, many points, you can see them distinctly in this symbol style. This is true, obviously, with many of the open symbols, but circles in themselves, the intersection too, doesn't form this separate image, so that makes them a little bit better. So there maybe is a correct answer. I think this is a good symbol to use in many situations. But then, of course, what if you have multiple data categories? You know, how do you approach that? So maybe you have one symbol and it's an open circle, but what if you need a second symbol? So if you're choosing different symbols, I'm showing you here some symbol options with weak visual boundaries. As you can see, you kind of look at this and it looks kind of like just a big blob of different shapes that are all vaguely like circle-y. If I kind of give them a little bit more boundaries, you can kind of see, oh, there's like blocks of different shapes. And then within each of those blocks, there's another shape that is different, which is maybe hard to see. And the reason it was hard to see is because they had weak visual boundaries. So the upside down triangle is pretty similar to the right side up triangle. Whereas if I showed you some symbols with strong visual boundaries, you might see it's like very easy. You look at them and you're like, oh yeah, those are distinct. And with multiple symbols, it's really important to try to use distinct forms of your symbols that when you look at them, they can very quickly be distinguished from each other. So you don't want your reader to have to look at this and like try to parse apart like what direction does that triangle go? You want your reader to be like, oh, is it a circle or is it a cross? And so you want to go with these strong visual boundaries. And there are different ways to create visual boundaries. So you could do something like these first 4 columns where you have strong shape differences. So the shapes are very, very different. Maybe you do some sort of bolding or shading where one group is like a very solid circle and one is sort of less solid circle. Or you can do something with color. And we're going to talk a lot about color, so I won't say more about that here, but I think that is a common way that people produce sort of strong visual boundaries. So that's what I'm going to say about symbols, but there are a lot of other things with thinking about clarity. One of them is grouping. This is something that we sort of do naturally. We group things when we see them. And this is going to be another question. So if you saw a figure that looked like this, how many groups of things would you say are here? Just based on the way this looks. And you can type your thought into the chat. Okay, so lots of 3s, some 2s, I see a 4, 9, okay. Many 3s, okay. And so just this exercise, like I haven't shown you anything. This is a slide with some squares on it. We automatically group things when we see them. And what this has also demonstrated is we kind of do this differently. So we can group things here. So I can easily get 3, a red group, a blue group, and a black group. But also like there's some groups inside the blue group, can group things even more finely. And this sort of demonstrates that you can use this grouping to your advantage, or it can confuse your readers. So if my goal here was to show you 3 groups, then many of you in the audience are confused, right? Because you see 7 groups or 9 groups or 4 groups. And so you want to use this to your advantage. You want your readers to see the groups you want them to see, and you don't want them to be making up other groups based on the way that you just made your figure. So this grouping here is based on proximity. So things that are sort of close together, we automatically assume are grouped together. But there's also spacing. So the way things are spaced, if they're similar space to other things, we sort of group them together. So you can kind of use these 2 principles to help your readers and to really emphasize the groups you want them to see. So if you're spacing things very regularly, that will help them sort of group them together. If you're putting things really close together that are supposed to be close together, that will help your readers. Okay, so that's grouping. We've talked about point styles. Let's think now about types of figures. So you want your figure to be really efficient. So you want your readers to like look at it and be like, oh, I understand. You also want it to be accurate, of course. And there are many ways you can do that. So these are different visualizations of the same 5 data points. Which one of these, if you had to choose, would you say is the most efficient and accurate? And you can type your answer into the chat. And it's okay if you don't know, you can just take a guess. You can even just choose the one that you feel like speaks to you the most. Depends. Lots of position with a question mark, none of them. Position or color. Okay, yeah, so angle, interesting. I have not ever thought about how to use an angle figure, but I would like to, I don't know, it could be possible, I think. This figure is actually organized from least accurate and efficient over to the right of most accurate and efficient. So color and volume and area and angle, those are all really hard for our minds to very quickly understand like how things are associated relative to each other. When you get over to the length and the position, the first position and the second position, it's sort of easier to compare them to each other. What makes this position, these ones farther on the right, more accurate and efficient is that when you give an axis and you have a shared axis, like in this final one, we can kind of compare the points to each other. But as somebody in the audience said, it kind of does depend, and it depends on what you're trying to show. I think in many cases, having an axis is very common in science, and so this makes a lot of sense. But there are a lot of times when we're also using color in various ways. We're going to talk later about how to do that in the best way we can. Okay, so I was thinking about figures, we've talked about grouping. The last thing for clarity is thinking about labels and legends. And this is something that is really, I think is really important. But I think a good practice is try to avoid forcing your reader to look at the caption to understand what is happening in a figure. So if I show you this figure, it's very common for us to put axis labels, so to tell you what the y and the x-axis mean. But you should also try to put a legend in the figure itself. So if I don't have this in here, the reader is going to have to go to the caption and say, okay, what does a triangle mean? What does a circle mean? What does the black line mean? What does the gray line mean? And if I have a legend in here, it's very clear, like you can look at this figure and sort of understand I'm doing a comparison here between historic and contemporary. You understand the point style for each of those categories. You understand the color for each of those categories. And it really helps increase the clarity for your readers. And yeah, anything you can do to sort of decrease the load, the mental load that your readers have to do when looking at your figures is helpful. And this is one that's just very, very easy to do. Okay, that's it for clarity. I'm going to take a drink here. And we're going to go on to talk about color next. So we've talked about clarity, and now we're going to talk about the second C, color. So color is something that people really like to use. It really is a great tool. We'll talk here at the end about some cautions and some precautions you might want to take. So we'll start again with a question. There are many different kinds of color palettes. I'm going to show you 3, and I'd like you to tell me which one is the best to use. So just like at the beginning, I showed you a bunch of different point styles. I have 3 color palettes here, 1, 2, 3. I'd like you to take a moment and tell me which of them you think is the best to use. Okay, so I see a lot of 3s, some 2s, a 1. Okay. A lot of 3s and 2s, it seems. Okay. I did see 1, it depends, or it depends on data. And that is actually the correct answer. So this is a trick question. The answer is it depends. And it depends on the kinds of data that you're using. And this is something that I think is a very common mistake that people make. Not all color palettes are created equal. Each of these 3 are different types. I'm going to walk you through the different types and what they mean, and then when to use them. So the first one of these is sequential. This is a sequential color palette, this option number 1. And what we have here is colors arranged from a low to a high using the lightness or the darkness of the color. So in this case, we have low, sort of like this pale cream color going up to the right in a dark brown. So this is like low to high. There are many other sequential palettes. You can do these in just grayscale. This could be in just one color like blue. You could have something that grades from a yellow to a blue, from a yellow to a red. This example at the top is from yellow to brown. But all of these are arranged in this like increasing darkness. And these are what we would call sequential palettes. The second palette I showed is a categorical color palette. So a lot of people chose this one as the one that they said was the best to use. So in a categorical color palette, there's no obvious like order to the colors. These palettes always have multiple colors, but there's no like clear way when you look at this palette, for example, to say the blue is better than the purple or green is better than yellow. Like there's no order to it. It's just a bunch of colors. And there are many, many categorical palettes that are out there. These are just a handful of common ones that are used. But what's common with all of these is there's no order. I couldn't put an arrow on this palette to tell you like which one of these things is better than the other. And the third one, I saw a lot of people chose number 3. I think that's because you probably see these kinds of palettes a lot, is a diverging color palette. So this is a palette that looks sort of like this. And diverging color palettes are those that include 2 colors that sort of diverge from a 0 value. So you have this spread out from a 0 value on both ends. And this is almost sort of like a sequential color palette on each side. So you have one sort of going from a white to a blue on the left, and one going from a white to a red on the right. And these can be in many colors. So you can have things from red to blue. This top one, red, yellow, blue, is very common in maps. But you can have ones that are red with white in the middle and blue on the other sides, any other color combinations. The commonality here is that this palette sort of diverges from the center out. And as I said, these are really common in maps. So you've probably seen these before. In maps, often you have something where you have an equal chance, and then lighter colors are like cooler than normal, and warmer colors are warmer than normal. So you probably see these kind of visualizations a lot in maps. And so going back to this question that I asked, this trick question of which one is the best to use, it depends. And then the question is like, okay, but when to use the different color palettes. So sequential color palettes, these first ones that go from light to dark, you want to use these when your data has an order. If you want your reader to understand that the light color is less than a dark color, your category, this light category, lower, dark category, higher, that's when you want to use these palettes. This could be confusing if that's not how your data is set up. Whereas a categorical palette, this is one where your data doesn't have an order. These are things like categories. If you're comparing different species, for example, you might color your species with a palette that doesn't have an apparent order. And that's to make it clear to your reader that there is no like, you know, the green species is better than the cyan species. Like you're not really saying that. So you don't want your reader to infer that from the colors. And then finally, this diverging palette, this is one that I see people use a lot, and not always correctly. So this is best to use when your data sort of diverges from a 0 value. So if you have a 0 value that's very like something that's in the middle, it doesn't have to be 0. It's just whatever you're saying things diverge higher and lower from. That's when you would like to use a diverging color palette. There are obviously exceptions to all of these statements I'm saying, but these are sort of best practices and ways to avoid causing confusion with your readers. And as I said at the beginning, so color is great, and I really like using colors in my figures, but you have to use caution. And that's because we have a lot of preconceived notions about color. So first, one thing that I've mentioned a few times is that using the wrong palette for your data can be confusing. So if I show you this map, for instance, this is a map that shows the estimated fraction of precipitation lost to evapotranspiration from 1971 to 2000. If you look at this, sort of try to understand the patterns here, and then I'm going to show you the color, what the colors mean here in a second. But I feel like when I look at this, for instance, I can make up a lot of stories about what's going on. Like, you know, we have the Pacific Northwest looks kind of different from the rest of the US here. We have sort of like this pattern here that goes down Appalachia and into the South. Have, you know, we can kind of separate the West out from the East, okay? If I show you this color palette, there's no real order to the colors. So white is 0, then we go to pink, then we go to purple, then we go to blue, then we go to light blue, and then some greens, some like a lime green and a yellow, and then brown. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And that's because we're using a categorical palette here when the data is sequential. The data goes from 0 up to 1.29, but the palette here of colors is going from just all over the place. It's an unordered palette. And so that can cause some confusion. And that's not what you would like in your reader. All right, caution number 2 is another thing that I've said is that people have ideas already about color. And I think color in particular, of all the things I'm going to tell you about today, is one that people have a lot of preconceived notions about. So for instance, if I show you something about temperature, and I show you something that's red and something that's blue, which one would you say is hot? Red or blue? Okay. Basically, everybody has said red. And that's because automatically, if you see red, you think hot. I like this, but the hottest stars are blue, says Sarah Gonzalez. Yes. Well, exactly. So if I were to say, okay, in my palette here, red is cold and blue is hot, that would make sense if we're thinking about stars. But the rest of us would be very confused. And so we have to sort of think about those things, right? There's a lot of these notions that we already have about colors. And if you're going to go in the opposite way of them, you really need to be careful about that. Similarly, if I'm showing you something about concentration or, you know, whatever the measure is, the quantity of some measure, if I show you these 3 squares, which one would you say is high and which one would you say is low? The more saturated one. Right one is high, darker is high, leftmost is low. Wonderful. So we have like these preconceived ideas of what is happening here. But if I decide when I'm making this figure that low is this one on the right and darker is the one on the left, that could be a little confusing because that's not what we automatically think when we see the figure. And so keep these things in mind as you're thinking about how to make your figures. Like, you want to use this to your advantage. You don't want to further confuse your readers. Caution number 3 is about proximity. This can change the way we see color. So this is something that I think many people like do when they're little and then maybe don't think about a lot when they get older. So if I show you these 2 squares, we have a little rectangle in the middle of each of them. Would you say these are the same color or different colors? These two here in the middle. Different, same. Many people saying different. Different but close. Jenny says they look different, but I think they're the same. Okay. Great. So there's like no clear consensus, I would say. It's kind of like not sure. The answers are actually the same. So if we look at them right next to each other, they're the same, but because they're within different colors, they look different. Exactly. This is like an optical illusion. So if I show you this next one, would you say these are the same or different? Different, same, many more difference. Now it's different. Okay, many people saying different, but a few people still saying the same. They look the same to me. Good, yep. So in this case, they're actually different, but I would say enough people said they looked the same that is concerning, right? Like you wouldn't want probably like 20% of the people looking at your figure to say something was the same if it was actually different. And you might think like, okay, when would this ever come into play in a scientific figure? Like, Stepfanie, this isn't actually important. I am sure you have all seen one of these like heat map style figures before. And what if I'm asking my reader to look at these two squares that have the asterisks in them, and I'm trying to tell them something about these two squares? It has something to do with my data. It's like really, really important. Are they the same or are they different? And you might say like, oh, it wouldn't be something that, you know, I would have to tell my reader about, like they would just see. So some people saying same, many people saying different. I hate those figures. I may not be red-green colorblind, but that palette is hard to look at. Agree. And yeah, so there's like lots of confusion about this, and I think that's really great because I think that's important to demonstrate. These are the same colors. They actually look different in this figure because this one is next to a bunch of dark reds. This one is next to a bunch of light reds. And so they look different by comparison to what is around them. And so first of all, if you're making a figure like this, you got to be careful about the colors you pick. But also you have to think about like what is going to be around them. And some of the comments in the chat about color blindness brings us to the next caution, which is color blindness is pretty common. I would assume a number of members in the audience can't see the number here that's in this circle. And you don't want to be, you know, defending your PhD and showing a figure that is not red-green colorblind friendly, because it's very, very common. And there are lots of ways to make sure your figures are colorblind friendly. There are a lot of palettes out there that already exist and are known to be colorblind friendly. You can go to this website or on the GitHub, I sort of point to some of these palettes. I know many people still like to make their own color palettes, which is great, and is something I do as well. But if you do that, you want to make sure you choose your figures or choose your colors for your figures wisely. One thing to do is to make sure that the colors switch nicely to grayscale, because that will make sure they're colorblind friendly. So one way to do this sort of manually is to vary hue and saturation and lightness. So how you would do this is to go from the inside of the color wheel, sort of spiraling outward. This will vary the hue and the saturation of the color you're choosing. And while you're doing that, you sort of vary the lightness level. So how light or dark the color will be. And that way, when you choose these colors, so these are the colors that sort of correspond to the ones chosen here on the color wheel, they will grade nicely in grayscale from a light color to a dark color. This is something that I think is sort of beyond what many people would think about when making figures. So I don't know that this is like a great starting point, but if you want to do this and you want to do it right, this is the way to do it. What I would suggest and what I have done in the past is a combination of this method using like a spiraling out on the color wheel, varying lightness and darkness, and then making your palette and putting it into some sort of online tester, basically. I really like this website called VizPalette. And this is a website that gives you, that looks sort of like this. What you do is you put in the colors that you're interested in. You just use either the hex codes or the RGB values. It shows you lots of nice visualizations of what those colors would look like in various types of figures. And then you can see all of these options here at the top. And if you click one of them, it shows you an idea of what these colors would look like in different kind of visual models. So in this case, in this kind of color blindness, this is how these 3 colors would look. So this is a good way if you want to go from like, you know, making your own palette. Like it's really important that you have particular colors for whatever your project is. I would definitely say test them in some way. There are lots of different online ways to do this. This one is just my favorite, but make sure you test them just to make sure that the colors do have really nice visual boundaries between them. Or the other way, use a pre-made color palette like we were talking about at the beginning. There are many of those and they're very easy to implement. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about color. I'm going to take a drink. And then we're going to go on to the E, which is emphasis. And obviously emphasizing is, I think, probably very clear what I mean here. You're trying to add special importance or prominence in your figures. So there's often something we're trying to make sure our readers see. And there's lots of different ways to do this. And the idea here basically is emphasis sets an object apart. So if I show you this just like blob of letters and you just look at it the way it is right now, I imagine you very easily see all of the red A's in there. They're very, very different. Now, if I asked you to find all of the P's, that might be harder. And that's because we haven't emphasized them in any way. If I ask you to find them, it's pretty hard. This is all of the ones I could find. So there are many of them, but they're kind of hidden in there. So if you're trying to have your readers see A's, okay, that's very easy. But if you're trying to emphasize P's here, that would be harder. So how do you go about emphasizing things? So there are a lot of different ways. We've just finished talking about color. That's a really easy way to do it. But you could think about size. So maybe the thing that you're emphasizing is bigger in the figure. You might do something with orientation. I think this one's sort of harder. I don't think we often think about orientation and the way we set up figures, but it's an option. Shape, we talked about choosing different shapes, and this is a very obvious way, I think, to emphasize or de-emphasize things. You can add a mark. If you're giving a presentation, you can use motion. I think this is a great one for conference presentations, for example. If you're trying to emphasize some part of the presentation, some part of your data, you can make it move. And then grouping. And we've talked about grouping as well, but you can see how like you could make a group of things that are all the same and separate one out as different. And that would emphasize the one that is different. So you can kind of use all of these things to your advantage when you're trying to emphasize different parts of your data set. With that being said, you don't want to go too far. So if I show you a figure like this, you're trying here to show different clusters with different shapes, using different colors to show different types of mutations, using different widths of the shapes to show few or many. You can't emphasize everything. So if you're trying to emphasize everything, that's not really going to work. Your readers are just going to get lost in all of the different shapes and colors and sizes that you're trying to show them. So in this case, maybe you choose, you basically have to make some decisions, right? You have to choose what you're going to emphasize, what you're not going to emphasize, because you can't do it all. So in this case, maybe you choose just to show different clusters and mutation, yes or no. Like you can't do all of the different things that are in the first figure, so you choose just 2. you could say, no, what's actually important is not the cluster, but it's the mutation, and we want all 3 categories of the mutation. And we do want to show if there's few or many. And so we choose a way of visualizing this that lets you do that. So you can show those things, but you can't also show the cluster. And that's okay. Like, there's many, many ways to visualize things. And the idea really is just you have to make some choices sometimes. And with emphasis in particular, you just can't emphasize it all. It's impossible. So you have to make some choices. And emphasis, that's all I wanted to say about that. You can obviously use color to emphasize. You can use clarity and the things we talked about in clarity with grouping, with point types, with different sizes of points. All of those things go into emphasis. But you just have to make some choices about what is important to emphasize and making sure that you do that clearly for your readers. All right, so finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about consistency. And this is something that, I don't know, I think about a lot and really bothers me in papers when I read them when they're not consistent. But the idea here is this sort of like a final step after you've figured out what figures you're going to make and like have written your paper, written your presentation. You want to make sure all of your figures sort of agree with each other. You want them to all be consistent. And so I'm going to start by showing you 3 figures from one of my papers that was published a few years ago. These are all I'm going to show. I'm not going to tell you anything about these figures. I just want you to look at them for a second. And then I'll tell you a little bit about how I think about consistency. Okay. Here's somebody's mic, but I don't think I can fix it. I'm going to move on, look at the figures, okay? So thinking about consistency in your papers and presentations, the first thing I think is that colors and symbols should mean the same thing across figures. Say that again, colors and symbols should mean the same thing. So if I show you these 3 figures, again, it doesn't matter if you know anything about what's in this figure. All you need to know in this case, you see 3 colors here, only colors I use. They all mean the same thing consistently across all 3 figures. That's important. So if I were to use blue somewhere to mean the thing that I had colored yellow in another figure, that would be confusing and also unnecessary. That adds another color in that your readers have to keep track of. So use color sparingly, but also make sure you use it to mean the same thing when you do use it. The next thing is something that I think is important too, is using the same font and trying to keep the size consistent and always readable for any text that you have in the figures. So you can see here, lots of instances of text that I have in these figures. But what you maybe did or didn't notice when you were looking at these is that it's the same. Like if I'm having a label on an axis, it's the same size and the same, it's bold or it's small or it's the same orientation. Like those things are all consistent. If I'm labeling something one way in a figure, I label it the same way in another figure. If I'm labeling A and B and C parts of a panel of a figure, I use the same text size. I use the same font style. I do all of the things the same across the figures. And I think this is something people do think about, but I think often what happens is people are like, well, I did that when I made the figure, but then like it was published or I put it in my presentation and it didn't look the same. Like, I tried, but it didn't work. And I think the best advice I can give about this is one of the things that will help avoid any problems of that is to save figures in the dimensions you intend them to be when they're published or when they go into your presentation. And the easiest way to do this, you can obviously do this in code. One thing that I like to start with, though, is in RStudio. If you use RStudio, is to export the figure and save it as a PDF. And when you do that, save it in the dimensions you intend to have it be. So if you want your figure to be 4x4, save it as 4x4. And you can, all of the journals that you will publish in have guidelines for how wide different figures can be. If you're doing like full page across width figure, if you're doing a 1-panel figure, if you're doing, you know, if your journal goes in like 3 columns, they'll have how wide a figure can be to take up 2 columns versus 3 versus 1. And you use those as guidelines for how big you want your figures to be. And if you do that, when you publish your paper, the journal's not going to resize your figure at all. It will be exactly the size you gave it to them in. It's just a little tip there. And then finally, I think sort of the bigger thing is to pick a figure style and stick with it. I think this is something that can be hard because obviously our style and our skill level evolves over time, but at least within a paper, within a project, pick a style that you like and stick with it. So like in all of these figures, you can kind of just look at them and tell that they are similar. It has similar colors, it has similar axis styles, it has similar labeling of the different panels within each figure. Even things as small as like this gray in the background of this phylogeny is the same gray that I use over here. And so like there is sort of a overall grouping of these together as one consistent entity. They are a thing that goes together. So that's the last thing I wanted to say about consistency. Just put a little thought into what you want your figures to be, what you want them to look like, and then try to apply that to them as a group. Think about them as individuals, obviously, but the next step is to then think about the whole project. Okay. I'm going to take a drink and wrap up and we can do questions. Okay. So I've been talking a lot about figures. And again, the goal here is to try to make your figure in such a way that it conveys your information really clearly, really accurately, and really efficiently. You obviously have taken a lot of time working with your data, doing your analyses, thinking through other aspects of your project, but you don't want to stop with that, like really important interrogation of your data at the point of like right before making your figures. You want to take that to the step of like, how do I make sure that this figure conveys what I want it to my readers? It's really important, and it really is a like crucial aspect of making sure your papers are high quality and will be read. Today we have talked about 4 sort of basic design principles. We've talked about clarity, so making sure your information is really clear, you're not confusing your reader, you're using grouping and point size and visual boundaries, and you're making sure all of that goes together to make your figure very clear and accurate. We talked about color, talked about different color palettes, sequential color palettes, we have categorical, we have diverging, talked about when to use the different color palettes, how it depends on the type of data that you have, as well as a number of cautions to think about with color in particular. And I know that color is something people really like to use, and so thinking about how to do that effectively is important. Talked a little bit about emphasis and how there are lots of ways to do that, some of which are color or different grouping or size or shape, but that you can't emphasize everything, and that there are often choices that have to be made in terms of what is important and what is not. And then finally, I told you a little bit about consistency and sort of applying these principles to the entire product as a whole. So thinking about the individual figures, but also thinking about how things carry across all of your figures as one entity. I termed these as at the beginning as 3 C's and an E to try to hopefully help you remember them. Clarity, color, emphasis, consistency. Hopefully that helps get you started on figures. I have some time. I don't think we have enough time to sort of discuss published figures, but what I will say is we can talk through some things. I can answer questions, and I will leave this up here so where you can email me or message me. Yeah, happy to take questions. I will try to make this so I can see. And feel free if you want to type questions in the chat, or if you want to turn your mic on, either is fine. And I will remind myself that I have a post-workshop survey as well. All right, any questions at any point in the presentation? You are all very welcome.
I did get a question. Oh, I saw someone write a question in the chat, I think. But I also had someone message me during your presentation asking for a link to the GitHub. Yeah. So would you mind dropping that in the chat? And then I think I saw another question from Catherine.
Yeah, I can put this right. And it is not really like a complete match to the presentation. It really is sort of like a companion to it. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so the first question was about posters that I saw, like, how do you think about these principles when making posters? So it is the same, I would say. I actually have in here like my process for making a poster. And this is true for like all of my work really. I start on paper. So I draft out how exactly I might make the thing on paper, and then go through a lot of iterations of like moving things around and editing things down, and sort of go back to paper, and then end up with the final product. I would say the only thing that differs with figures really is that a really good rule of thumb is if you print out your poster on just a regular 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, if you hold it at arm's length, you should be able to read what it says. And that will be a good indication that if it's printed as a poster size, somebody standing sort of a normal distance away from it will be able to read what it says. And that will give you an idea of like how big font needs to be, like how big figures need to be, like if I hold this thing out and it's printed on like a little piece of paper, can I understand it? Like, yeah, I would say that's the only thing that really differs with posters. There's a question here about the GitHub. Yeah, so there's a question about in the GitHub, I use transparency and alpha to sort of vary colors. And one of the reasons I do that is because at the beginning, the very, very beginning, we talked about using different symbol styles and how the sort of open circle is the best. But still with that, I like to use color because one of the things to think about with with all of this stuff is that it all kind of stacks, right? Like you can use color, but then you could also use shapes. And you can use those things, like if you have 3 groups, you have 3 colors, you could have 3 shapes. Like all of those things sort of stack on top of each other to help your reader really understand what you're trying to get them to see. So like if I am using these sort of open circles, I might also use color to differentiate them. But if I do that, then they sort of become more like solid circles. And so if you vary the alpha value, you sort of make it so that they fall sort of closer to this open circle. And so regions that are overlapping then get this similar property of a higher density. So you get a darker color in regions with overlap. You can obviously do this in many different ways. Like maybe you just want different shapes. Maybe you really just want closed circles, and that's okay. Like the overlap isn't that important. So there are, lots of ways to do this, but one of the ways I choose to do this is with this shape, but a transparent sort of color so that you can sort of see the overlap a little bit better. And yes, the presentation is recording, which is great. Thoughts on best making maps. I think that's an important thing and something that I haven't done that much of actually, which is why I don't talk too much about it. I think really the important thing with maps is the choice of color palette and like what exactly you're trying to visualize with the map. And I think one of the biggest things is that people often choose a palette that is incorrect for the kind of data that they have. And that's something that you kind of want to avoid. So if you're showing something that is sort of increasing, decreasing, like the values are important relative to each other, you want this sort of sequential color palette. Whereas if you are showing just like points, like sampling locations, and they don't have any order to them, you want a sort of categorical. And then diverging are used a lot in sort of like weather or like even like voting or like political type maps. Diverging color palettes are used a lot with maps because you sort of often have like a sort of reference 0 value that things are being compared to. So I'd say the best thing with making maps is make sure you're thinking carefully about how you're incorporating color. I would say there's often not like a lot of like symbol choice or anything like that in maps per se, but color is probably the important thing.
It looks like we have one more question and then we can wrap it up after that.
Yeah, so I actually have not ever thought about if you need to cite color palettes. It's probably not a bad idea. I don't think it's necessary, but I don't think it's a bad idea. With GitHub code, I think it is useful to like, reference the code that you're using. A lot of ways of doing that is like either referencing the paper directly that the code comes from, or like forking the GitHub repo and like editing it from there with your own code and like indicating that it sort of comes from this other place. But yeah, I haven't thought actually much about the citing of color palettes themselves. I think it's not common to do so in papers, but I think wouldn't be frowned upon either.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stepfanie. And thank you everybody for attending. Please be on the lookout for future emails about events. And also don't forget to fill out that survey that Stepfanie sent out.
Yeah, I would appreciate that.